The Clay-Kickers of Plugstreet. The earth did not smell of earth. It was a thick, cloying perfume of decay, cordite, wet wool, and the sour tang of men who had long forgotten the cleansing sting of soap. For Corporal Arthur Shaw, a 22-year-old former mining engineer from the damp pits of Nottingham, this subterranean stench was as familiar as his own sweat. He was a mole, a clay kicker, a soldier of the shadows who fought the war not in the shell-cratered hellscape above, but deep within the cold, silent bowels of Flanders. His battlefield was a tunnel, 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, a precarious passage shored up with rough-sawn timber that groaned like a living thing under the immense pressure of the world above. The air was a stagnant broth, thick with clay dust and a fear so palpable you could taste it, coppery and sharp on the tongue. His sun was a single, guttering candle wedged into a niche in the wall, its frail light throwing monstrous dancing shadows that mocked their humanity. Beside him, working with a rhythmic, practiced grace that bordered on the sacred, was Private Bill Taff Evans, a Welshman from the Rhondda Valley. Taff was on his back. His head and shoulders vanished into a tiny forward excavation, his boots firmly braced against a wooden crosspiece known as the cross. In his hands, he wielded the clay kicker's unique tool, a deadly-looking, short-handled spade with a specially designed grip. With a series of powerful, piston-like jabs of his legs, Taff would sink the razor-sharp blade into the dense blue-gray clay, twist with a practiced wrist, and extract a neat, compact lump of earth. Arthur, the bagger, would receive it in silence and pack it carefully into a sandbag, building the defensive wall behind them as they inched forward into the darkness. Jab, twist, pull, pass. Jab, twist, pull, pass. It was a hypnotic silent ballet performed in a tomb, their communication reduced to the occasional touch or a glance in the flickering light. They were close to their objective. Arthur could feel it in his bones, in the subtle, almost imperceptible vibrations that traveled through the clay, a sinister telegraph from the other side. Their mission was to plant a 5,000-pound ammonal charge directly beneath a German Stollen, a deep, reinforced dugout where perhaps 100 enemy soldiers would be eating, sleeping, writing letters home. The concept was abstract up top. Down here, it was horrifically intimate. They were not aiming at a trench or a machine gun nest. They were aiming at men in their latrines, in their bunks, in the middle of a laugh or a nightmare. Arthur's mind, a traitor in the silence, drifted to a world of green. He saw the rolling hills of Nottinghamshire, the feel of genuine sun on his face, a sensation becoming as mythical as a fairy tale. He thought of Eleanor, her face a soft focused photograph in his mind, the scent of her lavender water a ghost in the foul air. He remembered the fervor in the town square, the brass band, the stern pointing finger of Lord Kitchener. Your country needs you. The poster was a bold, clean lie. It showed no men caked in filth, trembling in the dark, their souls shrinking with every inch they advanced. It spoke of glory, not of the gut-wrenching terror of a counterminer's pickaxe suddenly bursting through the wall in a spray of soil and splinters, followed by the flash of a Luger. A sound. It was faint, a mere whisper against the eardrum, but it froze them both solid. Tap, tap, scrape. Then, silence. Taff's legs went still. Slowly, with infinite care, he slid out of the excavation niche. His face, a mask of streaked clay and beaded sweat, was ashen. His eyes, wide and white-rimmed, locked with Arthur's. In that shared glance was a universe of understanding. The hunters were not alone. The Germans were there, listening, digging, perhaps only a few yards away, separated by a thinning wall of earth. The delicate auditory war they had been waging had just become terrifyingly immediate. Arthur's heart began a frantic, pounding rhythm against his ribs, a kettle drum of panic he was certain must be audible through the soil. This was the moment every clay kicker trained for and dreaded in equal measure. The moment the war ceased to be about maps and grand offensives and became a brutal, personal struggle for air and life in a hole no wider than a coffin. He gestured sharply, a chopping motion towards the rear. The ammonal chamber was forgotten. Survival was the only mission now. They had to listen, to pinpoint the enemy's location and direction. Arthur pressed his ear hard against the cold, damp wall of the tunnel. The sounds were clearer now, insulated by the earth. The rhythmic, metallic ching of a pickaxe, the softer, shushing sound of a shovel, and then, unmistakably, the low murmur of voices, guttural, alien, and far too close. He made his decision. He pointed again, more urgently, back down the long, dark throat of their tunnel. Retreat, now. But as Taff began to shuffle backwards, his body scraping softly against the dirt floor, the universe intervened. A deep, shuddering crump echoed from far above, the signature of a heavy howitzer shell. A fraction of a second later, the concussion wave hit. It traveled through the ground not as sound, but as pure, violent force. The world dissolved. The timber frame beside Arthur let out a sharp crack, like a rifle shot. A main support beam splintered, surrendering to the pressure. Instantly, the roof gave way. A torrent of wet clay, chalk, and rubble poured into the confined space. Arthur was thrown forward, his head smashing against a remaining prop. Stars of pain and light exploded behind his eyes. The candle was snuffed out, plunging them into an absolute, suffocating blackness that seemed to swallow sound itself. When the roaring in his ears subsided, the first thing he heard was Taff's voice, a high, strangled whisper. "Arthur, my legs. I can't feel my legs. I can't move." Blind, Arthur's hands became his eyes. He scrabbled in the dirt, finding Taff's shoulder, then tracing down his body. His questing fingers met not legs, but a cold, unyielding mass. A heavy timber beam lay across Taff's thighs, pinning him mercilessly. A mound of collapsed earth bearing him to the waist. They were entombed. "Easy, Taff. Easy, mate," Arthur whispered, the words ash in his dry throat. "I'll get you out." It was the lie you had to tell, the script you had to follow, even when both of you knew the truth. He was trapped, and they were running out of time. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, clawing at the dirt with his bare hands, ignoring the searing pain as his fingernails tore and his fingertips grew raw and bloody. He managed to clear some of the debris from around Taff's chest and arms, but the main beam was as immovable as the earth itself. "Listen," Taff breathed, his voice tight with a new kind of fear. Arthur froze. From the other side of the collapse, through the newly fallen earth, came the sound of digging. But it was different now. Not the careful, stealthy probing of before. This was urgent, forceful, determined. The Germans weren't just listening anymore. They were coming through. "They're going to finish us," Taff said, a tremor of pure terror in his voice. "They'll use grenades." Arthur's hand found the cool, checkered grip of his Webley revolver. In the open field, it was a last resort. Down here, in this darkness, it was the final arbiter. He checked the cylinder by touch alone. 5 rounds. He would not be buried alive without a fight. He would not let them take Taff. He positioned himself as best he could, pointing the weapon towards the source of the sound, his back against the tunnel wall, his free hand resting on Taff's shoulder, a final point of contact. The digging grew louder, more intense. Clods of earth dislodged and pattered to the floor. Then, a miracle and a terror simultaneously. A sliver of light, faint and wavering, pierced the absolute black. A German carbide lamp. Arthur's finger tightened on the trigger. He could hear their voices clearly now. Sharp, urgent commands. He could smell their tobacco, their damp wool uniforms. A mirror image of their own existence. He waited. He waited for the pickaxe to smash through the remaining barrier. He waited for a face to appear in the hole, for the blinding flash of a muzzle. He prepared to fire all 5 rounds into the breach, to sell their lives as dearly as this cramped space would allow. But the pickaxe didn't come. The digging stopped. A voice called out, not a yell, but a firm, clear question spoken into the silence. "Hallo? Ist jemand lebendig? Is someone there? Alive?" Arthur's breath hitched. He didn't speak German, but the meaning was unmistakable. The question itself was a shock. It was human. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was sealed shut by fear and disbelief. He just held the revolver, aimed at the beautiful, terrible light. There was a moment of silence. Then, a muffled conversation. Then, a different sound. Not the violent tearing of a pick, but the careful, deliberate scrape and slice of shovels. They were digging, but not to attack. They were digging to clear the collapse, to reach them. Minutes stretched into a lifetime. The hole grew larger, the size of a head, then a torso. The lantern light flooded their tiny prison, illuminating the horrific scene in stark, shocking relief. Taff's pale, pain-twisted face, the cruel timber beam, the dark stain soaking through his trousers, Arthur himself, wild-eyed and pointing a gun. Arthur squinted, his aim unwavering. A shape blocked the light. A German soldier, his face impossibly young and streaked with grime, peered into the tunnel. His eyes, a startling blue, widened as they took in the scene. His gaze moved from the threatening muzzle of the revolver to Arthur's desperate face, then down to Taff's broken body. For a long, suspended moment, they stared at each other across the few feet of no man's land that separated them. The German's expression was not one of hatred or battle lust, but of stunned comprehension. He said something over his shoulder, his voice low. Another face appeared, older, wearier, framed by a grizzled beard and wearing the insignia of a Gefreiter. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, scanned the situation with a quick, professional efficiency. He looked at Arthur's unwavering revolver, then at Taff, then back at Arthur. Slowly, deliberately, he held up his empty, gloved hands. "Kamerad," the older German said, his voice a low rumble. He pointed at Taff, then made a lifting motion with his hands. "Helfen, we help. Verstehen? Help." Arthur's world, already fractured, shattered completely. This defied all logic, all training, all the propaganda. The man in his sights was the enemy. He was the reason they were down here. The reason Taff was crushed and dying. He was the faceless Hun, the barbarian. But he was also offering the one thing they needed more than victory, more than orders, more than breath itself, a chance. His arm began to shake violently. The weight of the Webley felt like 100 pounds. He looked at Taff, whose eyes were closed, but whose hand had crept up to clutch weakly at Arthur's ankle. The plea was not for a heroic last stand, but for life. With a slow, deliberate movement that felt like the most significant act of his life, Arthur eased the hammer down and let the heavy revolver fall with a soft thud onto the clay floor. The German Gefreiter Hans, he would learn, gave a single, sharp nod. He barked an order, and two more German miners, their faces curious and cautious, squeezed into the hole. They set to work with a quiet, focused efficiency. They had a small, mechanical jack, which they positioned under the beam. With slow, creaking turns, they lifted the immense weight from Taff's legs. They worked in a strange, collaborative silence, the only sounds their labored breathing and the scrape of shovels. The unspoken truce held, fragile and profound. In that moment, they were not British and German. They were miners, comrades in a shared, desperate struggle against the true enemy, the crushing, indifferent earth. It took 20 agonizing minutes. When Taff was finally freed, his legs were a horrifying sight, bent at unnatural angles, the bones clearly broken. The Germans were surprisingly, tenderly careful. One of them, the young blue-eyed boy, produced a field dressing and began to wrap Taff's wounds, while the others fashioned a makeshift stretcher from a ground sheet and two stout pieces of timber. Hans looked at Arthur. He pointed a thick finger at his own chest. "Hans." Then he pointed at Arthur. "Arthur," he croaked, the words strange and rusty. Hans nodded, as if filing the information away. He gestured for Arthur to take the front of the stretcher. One of the younger Germans took the back. Without another word, they began the slow, arduous journey back through the German tunnel. A bizarre and silent funeral procession for a life not yet lost. The German tunnels were wider, better constructed, Arthur noted, with a detached part of his mind. The same hell, just with different signage. They emerged into the German frontline trench near Plugstreet Wood. The gray, rain-swept morning light was physically painful after the long, absolute darkness. A group of German infantrymen, huddled around a small stove, stared in open-mouthed astonishment as the mud-caked, multinational group climbed out of a saphead. They were led to a first aid post, a dugout reinforced with concrete and sandbags, not so different from their own. A German medical orderly, with a Red Cross armband, immediately began cutting away Taft's trousers, his face grim but his hands gentle. As Arthur stood there, numb, shivering, and utterly spent, Hans approached him. He held out a small, dented flask. Arthur took it, his own hands trembling so violently he almost dropped it. He unscrewed the cap and drank. It was schnapps, harsh, fiery, and medicinal. It burned a path of clean, searing heat down his throat, cutting through the taste of clay, blood, and fear. Hans looked at the young British corporal, this ghost from the underworld he had pulled from certain death. He gestured with a sweep of his arm at the dugout, at the mud, the endless sandbags, the weary, resigned faces of his own men. Alle Scheisse, he said, his voice flat. Then he seemed to search for a simpler word. Schrecklich, ja? Terrible, yes? Arthur met his gaze. He saw no hatred, no triumph, only the same bottomless exhaustion, the same haunted, thousand-yard stare he saw in the eyes of his own comrades. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, who had been buried too deep. He simply nodded, a universal language of shared suffering. A few hours later, under a temporary local truce arranged by a shouted conversation across the wire, Arthur and the stretcher-bearing Taff were passed back to the British lines at the edge of no man's land. The transaction was surreal, conducted with a quiet bureaucratic efficiency amidst the pervasive stench of death. The last thing Arthur saw before he turned his back was Hans, the German miner, standing on the fire step of his trench. He raised a single, gloved hand in a silent, solemn farewell, before turning and disappearing back into the mouth of his own dugout, descending once more into the dark, waiting earth. Back in his own sector, debriefed by a clean, skeptical lieutenant who smelled of soap and pipe tobacco, Arthur's story was met with disbelief. The Boche helped you? Pulled your man out? Nonsense, Corporal. You're shell-shocked. They probably caused the collapse with their own mining. You're lucky to be alive. The official report would read, Corporal Shaw, disoriented following a tunnel collapse, made his way back to friendly lines with wounded Private Evans. The words were meaningless. He could not convey the profound, world-shattering strangeness of it all. That night, as the evening hate began and the sky lit up with flashes of orange and white, Arthur lay on his bunk, the ghostly taste of schnapps still on his tongue. He closed his eyes and saw not the monstrous caricature of the enemy from the posters, but the tired, resigned eyes of a man named Hans, and he understood, with a clarity that chilled him to the marrow, that the real war was not between nations, but between the men in the mud, the clay-kickers, the infantry, the gunners, and the vast, indifferent machinery of governments and generals that had buried them all there. They were all trapped in the same dark tunnel on both sides of the line, waiting for the world above to finally, irrevocably, blow itself to pieces. And in that darkness, he had found, for a fleeting moment, a spark of shared humanity, a glimmer of light that made the surrounding blackness seem all the more profound and terrible. It was a knowledge that would haunt him far longer than the memory of any battle. It was the true unending war, and it had only just begun.